So I just finished reading this book by George Packer called Our Man, which is his biography of Richard Holbrooke, who was a US diplomat, probably most famous for his role in the Dayton Accords, which brought an end to the Bosnian War in the Balkans. And I was very struck just reading the chapter on Dayton, how the peace talks very nearly collapsed on quite a number of occasions because of the issue of land. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. I've got a handy map that I found online. So this is what Bosnia used to look like before the war. And this is what it looked like after the war, after the ethnic cleansing. Now, the thing to realize about Bosnia is that within Bosnia, there were three different ethnic groups. So you have the Bosnian Croats, who are represented here in blue. You have the Bosnian Serbs, who are represented here in orange. And you have the Bosnian Muslims, who I'll call Bosniaks, represented here in green. And at Dayton, the Bosnian Croats were represented by the president of Croatia, which is technically a separate state, a man called Tuchman. And the Bosnian Serbs were represented by Milosevic, the Serb president. Milosevic always denied that he had any role in the atrocities committed in the Bosnian War. And he presented himself as a sort of peacemaker, interested in bringing stability to the region. But everybody knew that he was the sort of kingmaker. So he was invited. And the Bosniaks themselves were represented by the president of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a man called Izetbegovic. So it's a sort of three-sided negotiation, but really it's two-sided. Or to put it differently, the most thorny issues were to be decided between the Bosnian Serbs, and the Bosniaks. And things were so thorny that, in fact, it took 16 days for the two sides to meet face to face for the first time to discuss territory. And the only reason that they met is because Holbrooke managed to maneuver this situation into being. So he arranged for both Milosevic and a man called Silajic, who was one of Izetbegovic's top advisors, so on the Bosniak side. He arranged for them both to be in this restaurant, this empty restaurant. And you had Milosevic on one side of the empty restaurant, and you had Silajic on the other side of the empty restaurant. And Holbrooke basically took a napkin and he went between the two parties, acting as their messenger and their go-between. He said, Milosevic is willing to give up this, Silajic is willing to talk about this, and he did this a few times. And eventually the two sides agreed to sit across each other in the same booth and talk about things face to face for the first time. And the very first thing that they wanted to discuss was a town called Gorazde, which you can't see on the map, but it would be here. And you can see that before the ethnic cleansing, Gorazde was firmly in green Bosniak territory. But after the ethnic cleansing, Gorazde was basically the last remaining Muslim enclave in eastern Bosnia. And what the Bosniaks wanted was for Gorazde not to be cut off from the rest of Bosniak territory. So for hours, Milosevic and Silajic argued over every village, every mosque from Gorazde all the way to Sarajevo. But they were successful, so they managed to carve out this green Bosniak territory so that Gorazde wouldn't be stranded in this orange sea of Serbs. So this was significant progress made 16 days into the negotiations. But there were concerns that Sarajevo would actually be the far bigger sticking point, because what the Bosnian Serbs wanted was for Sarajevo to be divided, like post-war Berlin or East and West Jerusalem, whereas the Bosniaks wanted Sarajevo as their undivided capital. And to everyone's surprise, it was actually Milosevic who sort of saved the day, because he essentially agreed to cede Sarajevo to the Bosnians. He agreed to their demands, essentially throwing his Bosnian Serb allies under the bus. And he had this to say, I'm quoting from the book, to Silajic. He said, "You deserve Sarajevo because you dug a tunnel and went in and out like foxes. But you fought for it, and those cowards killed you from the hills." And he didn't even show the Bosnian Serbs, the map. So he just completely cut them out from these discussions. So by that point, Gorazde had been sorted, Sarajevo had been sorted. There was plenty of momentum going on, and there was optimism in the air. Except then disaster struck because Milosevic wandered over to the Bosniak quarters and he saw a map that he was not meant to see. And this map, this chart, basically summarized all the gains that the Bosniaks had made in the talks so far. And it said in big letters that the Bosniaks would get 58% of the territory. And Milosevic looks at this figure and he flies into a rage. Why? Because in 1994, admittedly, when the military situation was a lot worse for the Bosniaks, they had agreed to the 51-49 formula, whereby the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which comprised the Croat land and the green Bosniak land, that federation would get 51% of the territory. And the Republika Srpska, which is the orange Serb bit, would get 49% of the territory. And this was the understanding, this was the basis of the understanding between Holbrooke and Milosevic. And this was the basis of the whole talk. So Milosevic was not willing to deviate from this figure. It was very important to him. So then Milosevic and Seljajic just stare at maps all evening, past midnight, into the very early hours of the morning, just trying to figure out where they can get the 7% from. And they're bartering bits of land, carving out bits of land, and none of this land is particularly valuable. There are no people there, no houses, no anything. It's literally just rocks and mountains. But it's really, really important to Milosevic that the number 51-49, that ratio is upheld. So they spend ages going back and forth. And eventually at about 3:30 in the morning, Seljajic has a brainwave. And he says, okay, we'll give up a chunk of territory in Western Bosnia. It's not worth much, it's just rocks and mountains, but that will bring the number to 51-49. And Milosevic looks at it and he agrees. So then everybody is elated. They're toasting each other, champagne is brought out, and they think that peace has finally been achieved. At this point, the Croat president is obviously still asleep. So they summon the Croat foreign minister to sort of officially, formally give his blessing. Except when the Croat foreign minister looks at the map, this time he flies into a rage because all the land that had been given up was Bosnian Croat land. And he says, this is absolutely unacceptable. So the mood is dampened. The peace had lasted maybe half an hour, at which point Izetbegovic makes a very curious offer. He says, I am willing to yield 1% of Muslim land, but in return, he asks for Brčko, which is this bit here in brown. Now, Brčko, before the ethnic cleansing, had been Bosniak. You can see that it's firmly green here. But ever since its ethnic cleansing in 1992, it had been held by Serbs. And it was a strategically vital city for the Serbs for obvious reasons, because it connects the two parts of the Republika Srpska. As a result, every single diplomatic map had awarded Brčko, had given Brčko to the Serbs. The debate hitherto had been how wide or narrow to make this corridor around Brčko, but the idea that Brčko would be Serb had not been contested until this moment. So the Americans are fed up. They say, this is not a serious offer. Nobody is serious about peace. And so they call the whole thing off. Clinton's visit is cancelled. There are press releases drafted announcing the failure of the talks, and everyone is going to go home the next day. Holbrooke is obviously dejected, and he thinks, this is it, it's a failure. Except the next morning, Milosevic comes through. Because Milosevic really, really, really wants peace. He is sick and tired of the fighting, and he also wants the sanctions to be lifted on his country. So he, the next morning, says, quote, that he is willing to walk the final mile for peace. And what he says is that he is willing to submit the status of Brčko to international arbitration in a year's time. Now, this changes the game entirely. Izetbegovic is presented with this offer, and he thinks about it, and he is silent for a very, very long time. And then he says, it is not a just peace, but my people need peace. And just like that, peace was secured, having literally been on the brink of collapse. George Packer describes these talks as, quote, diplomacy in its most human form, the bruising collisions of raw psyches. And it's undoubtedly an inspiring tale of resilience, of perseverance, of persistence, and it's rightly remembered as the high watermark of the American unipolar moment. But I think it also shows us the limitations of diplomacy, because Izetbegovic was right, this was not a just peace. But diplomacy is about securing a sustainable peace, not necessarily justice. And all too often, the two don't actually go hand in hand in the real world that we live in. And with that in mind, I want to end with a quotation from a passage in the book by George Packer. The end of the war came much too late for the living and the dead. The peace was, as Izetbegovic said, unjust. What the Serbs gained by murder, they were allowed to keep by agreement. You can't blame Holbrooke for that. By the time he took over, the Republika Srpska was a stubborn fact. The time to reverse it was in 1992 or 93. By 1995, Holbrooke's only purpose was to end the war. That was what Bosnians needed more than anything. Izetbegovic felt crucified at Dayton, but when he returned to Sarajevo, his people cheered him for bringing peace. Bosnia remained ethnically cleansed. Serb intransigence and Western weakness kept Karadzic and Mladic, who were the Bosnian Serb warlords, safe from the War Crimes Tribunal for another decade and a half. Elections entrenched all the nationalisms that had brought the war and the corruption that had fed on it. And Bosnian Serb politicians cut the stitches sewn into the Dayton Accords to give Bosnia a chance to heal. With or without war, their thinking remained the same. A fascist project, Seladic said, received the imprimatur of the international community. Bosnians with a certain notion of Western values never got over their disillusionment. The farther we get from the war, the less Dayton is seen as a great thing. People who didn't live through the killing of children and the hunger and cold can easily pick the agreement apart. But diplomats get what they can in the short term.